Hello class and welcome to a new analysis of Philip Larkin's At Grass. At Grass, published in 1950 and later collected in The Less Deceived in 1955, describes two retired racehorses who were once famous but now graze in a quiet field. Its main themes are the transience of fame and the peace that can be found in anonymity. Larkin was reportedly moved to write it after watching a newsreel about the celebrated racehorse Brown Jack. Before we look at the stanzas, let us pause on the title itself. At Grass is only 2 words, yet it does a great deal of work. At Grass is an idiom from horsekeeping. A horse at grass is a horse put out to pasture, retired from work or racing. So before the poem even begins, the title signals retirement. Let's move on to stanza 1. I'll leave you a moment to read the stanza and form your own opinion before I begin the analysis. So as you have read, this stanza shows us the horses as they are now, barely visible, sheltering in the shade, moving quietly and completely anonymous. The stanza opens with a striking synecdoche. In the line, "the eye can hardly pick out," the observer is reduced to a single detached eye. The effect is one of distance and objectivity. Then the barely visible nature of these horses acts as a symbolism. What this literally means is that the horses are so far away that one cannot see them from the other side of the field. However, symbolically, this could mirror their vanished celebrity, and so it could indicate the theme of lost fame. Just like the horses are physically small when viewed from afar, they are also small and insignificant in society, as they have become quite unimportant and irrelevant after their retirement. And this is really reinforced by the pathetic fallacy in cold shade. The phrase cold shade creates an atmosphere of chill, withdrawal, and obscurity that reflects the horse's obscurity and faded fame. Then, in line 3, Larkin uses personification. The wind distresses tail and mane. The verb distresses gives the wind emotional force. Then, lines 4 and 5 give us parenthesis. The other seeming to look on is set apart within the sentence, as an interruption, slowing the pace to match the horse's unhurried life. Finally, the stanza closes on the crucial diction of anonymous again. The horse becomes one among many. After having borne famous names, the horses fall into anonymity. The adverb again add a further layer. Anonymity is their repeated and natural condition, and fame was only the interruption, a temporary phase. By nature, horses are meant to be anonymous and unknown. Let's now move on to stanza 2. As always, please pause the video, read it for yourself, and form your own opinion before I begin the analysis. This stanza is the poem's turn into the past. 15 years ago, a handful of races was enough to make these horses famous. Their names were woven into the classic race meetings of long summer afternoons. In fact, the stanza opens with a volta, signaled by the conjunction yet. With this one word, Larkin pivots the poem from present to past. Then the time phrase 15 years ago anchors that shift and acts as an analepsis, a flashback, so to speak, that pulls the poem out of the present moment and back into the horse's racing days. Then comes the diction of 24 distances sufficed. Distances is racing diction for race lengths. About 24 races sufficed to build a legend. The verb sufficed here shows how little reality myth requires. Then the word fable acts as a metaphor. It conveys that the public turned the horses into a story, into a legend, larger than the animals themselves. And the passive voice of this verb, to fable, really shows how fame is something done to the horses by others, and not something the horses themselves possess or want. Next, notice the diction of faint afternoons. The adjective faint suggests these afternoons lack clarity and precision. They are remembered by the speaker and appear fuzzy and dreamy, as if the glory days are already dissolving even as they are recalled. This really shows how memory can never reenact perfectly what once has lived. It is always an imperfect and slightly distorted copy. Line 4 then uses polysyndeton of cups and stakes and handicaps. The repeated "and" in the enumeration of the races creates an effect of accumulation, amplifying the horse's feats. Alongside this sits the capitalization of every single one of these nouns. This capitalization gives the event ceremonial weights. And by the way, if you're not really familiar with horse racing, well, neither am I. Cups, stakes, and handicaps are types of races that horses partake in. Then, in line 5, the passive voice of "their names were artificied" is crucial. The horses are objects, not agents. Fame happened to them. Finally, the stanza closes with the metaphor "to inlay." The names are inlaid like a decorative material set into the surface of the summer, as a craftsman sets ornament into wood. Faded, however, indicates that these Junes, these summers where these horses competed are now faded, are now forgotten. The glamour of the word inlay is therefore immediately undercut. Let's now move on to stanza 3. As always, please pause the video, read the stanza for yourself, and form your own opinion before I begin my personal analysis. So as you have read, the stanza plunges us into a vivid flashback of race day itself. The jockeys, silks, the crowds, the cars, the heat and litter, and above all, the enormous roar of the crowd. The stanza opens with sibilance in silks at the start against the sky. The hissing sounds mimic the rush of excited breath, the crowd's collective intake as the race is about to begin. It really recreates the exhilaration one felt attending these races. And the very first word of the stanza is actually a metonymy. The word stands in for the jockeys wearing them. So by writing the silks, Larkin actually means the jockeys. And this is a pattern throughout the poem. People appear only as parts and objects, not as actual individuals and persons. The crowd is present everywhere, yet no person is actually seen. And this is evident in this stanza, where the crowd is symbolized and represented through the objects they bring, but is never actually mentioned. And this becomes quite obvious in the enumeration. Images are stacked side by side with almost no main verbs. It is a rapid slideshow of snapshots. The pace is quick, breathless, and cinematic. And it really recreates the sensory overload of a race day. And within that list sits a military metaphor in the squadrons of empty cars. The military noun squadrons imposes regimented order despite the popularity of the event. It is perhaps an allusion to the parking lots of neatly packed cars, row upon row. This image therefore conveys the massed and organized scale of the crowds gathered to see these horses. The climax of the stanza is undoubtedly the personification of the long cry of the crowd, which hangs unhushed. The crowd's roar becomes a living thing hanging in the air, persisting, permeating the air, and lasting. This hanging sound is intensified by the enjambment on that line. The enjambment lets the sound spill over the line, ending suspended just as the cry itself is suspended in the air above the racecourse. Finally, the stanza ends with the diction of stop-press columns on the street. So here the long cry, the roar of the crowd is transcribed into the newspapers, into columns. The living cry dwindles into cold print and is hurried into newspapers. Well, this is by far the sharpest comment on fame. The roar of thousands becomes tomorrow's disposable paper. This exciting and exhilarating event is reduced to a short passage in insignificant newspaper, Let's move on to the penultimate stanza, stanza 4. As always, please pause the video, read the stanza for yourself, and form your own opinion before I present my own analysis. This stanza returns to the present and asks whether the horses miss any of it. As far as we can read it, they absolutely do not. Everything has stolen away except the peaceful meadows, and their names survive only in record books. The stanza opens with a simile. Do memories plague their ears like flies? Memories of fame here are compared to flies, small, irritating, and insistent pests. Then comes a pathetic fallacy in dusk brims the shadows. The falling evening here reflects the horses' stage of life. Symbolically, evening gestures towards the horses' approaching end, their death. Yet, brims suggests fullness and completion rather than loss. It is therefore not during their race days, but very much during their final years that they seem and feel more fulfilled. Line 3 gives us repetition. Summer by summer, all stole away. The doubled summer enacts the slow and cyclical passing of years. And these summers were stole from the horses who weren't able to enjoy their lives but were treated as an object of spectacle and excitement for thousands and thousands of watchers and spectators. Line 4 then presents a lexical set of races. The starting gates, the crowd cries. It is a bare list which itemizes everything that has vanished. The entire apparatus of the racing world has completely disappeared as the horses enjoy their final years in peace. And against all this fad, all this excitement, this craze, stands the neologism unmolesting. Here, the meadows in which the horses graze in their final years is described negatively through negation, through what it is not. And what it is not is molesting. What these meadows do not do is they do not bother, they do not harass, they do not demand, and they do not molest. And by implication, this means that the fame did molest. The crowds and stopwatches were a kind of harassment for these horses. So here, peace is defined not by what it is, but what it is not. Peace is presented as the opposite of fame, the opposite of attention. Alongside it, the symbolism of the meadows is quite important. Meadows suggest rest, safety, nature, and retirement. They are the counterweight to everything in the lexical set just above. The stanza closes with the diction of almanac. Their names survive only as a record, filed away in almanacs and form books. Sorry, I think I was a bit late on the slides, but here you have the completed slide of the stanza, which you can pause to look at. Personally, I will move on to stanza 5, the final stanza. Please pause the video, read the stanza for yourself, and form your own opinion before I tell you mine. So in this final stanza, the poem is really completed in its main argument. The horses have shed their famous names entirely and lived in unwatched contentment. But beneath this gentle image of rest lies death, which no one can escape and which is inevitable. The stanza opens with the metaphor, have slipped their names. Or we usually say that horses have slipped a halter. However, these horses have slipped their names. Fame is like a restrictive tack, a tool, an equipment which these horses have finally shrugged off. These horses finally feel free after having cast off that petulant little equipment which was attached to them, which was fame. And this is reinforced by the idiom stand at ease, which is borrowed from the military world. One says, stand at ease to soldiers when discipline relaxes. And these horses were in some way just like soldiers. They were constrained to very strict rules in terms of diet, in terms of exercise, in terms of performance. But they can finally relax all that discipline that they are no longer compelled to have. Notice the echo to stanza 3 and the squadrons. We really have this military language in this poem. Then lines 3 and 4 are a synecdoche. Here, the field glass on one hand and the stopwatch on the other, which are mere instruments, are actually meant to symbolize and to represent the people using them. And in this case, it is the spectators of these horse races. So here the watchers are reduced to their instruments, to the instruments that they used to use. This might show how these watchers really instrumentalized the horses and treated them as absolute objects. They had a purely utilitarian relationship with them, as shown by these tools. There is also a contrast in the penultimate line. Only the grooms and the groom's boy. The numeral adjective only here acts as a complete contrast with the scores and scores of people, the crowds that turned out to see these horses. The famous audience is now gone. Only workers remain. And the poem finally closes with symbolism. The grooms and the groom's boy arrive during the evening with bridles in order to, if I had to guess, bring and lead the horses. And where is that somewhere? Well, the word evening, which suggests darkness, might show that that place is death, demise. Evening symbolizes life's end, and the bridle suggests a final leading away. Death is definitely present here, but it is gentle and domestic and kind. The horses are not abandoned in their anonymity. They are led home at the close of day by the only people who knew them as horses rather than as names. Now that we've actually explored the content of the poem, let's briefly dwell on rhythm and form. In terms of form, the poem consists of 5 regular sestets, 6-line stanzas of even length, giving the page a calm and ordered, symmetrical shape. This formal composure mirrors the horse's composed existence. Rhythmically, the poem runs in a steady, iambic tetrameter. It is a very gentle rhythm, which is suited to the modest and peaceful life of the horses. And on that note, let's make a brief conclusion. Overall, this poem can be summarized with 2 main themes. Firstly, the transience of fame. The horse's celebrity was built from 24 distances, which drew crowds of thousands and thousands of people. However, these crowds were reduced to stop press columns. They were reduced to the newspaper. And finally, they were almanaced. The names were written into record books and ultimately forgotten by the common folk. Fame, the poem insists, is brief, artificial, and external to the creature who bears it. The second theme is peace in anonymity. The unmolesting meadows, the horses standing at ease and galloping for what must be joy, free of any outside attention, define happiness as freedom from attention. Freedom, as I said before, isn't defined positively by what it is, but by what it is not. Freedom is the opposite of what these horses had to endure in their racing days. Therefore, to be anonymous is like a homecoming. It is a liberation for these animals. And with that, I think we've covered the poem quite extensively. Please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a nice one.